Okay, everybody, we're back. This is Ficklin Media, and my good friend Kevin Staton will be joining us momentarily. Uh, so good afternoon, everybody. Latimer. We're just waiting for Kevin Staton to join us, our guest for the day, and here he is now. Kevin, just do a sound check. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, I can hear you, Tom.
Great, I can hear you, and welcome. And let's kick it off. I mean, the topic today is really, well, it's important. I think it's been important for a long, long time in terms of how do we celebrate our spirituality and what does it mean in terms of it really giving us loaves and fishes here as well as in the by and by. So you particularly had seen an article about the waning of the Black church, and I can recall attending an event at Howard University. Kane Hope Felder was there, and this was perhaps 25 years ago when he was speaking about the perils and rocky shoals that the church is now kind of sailing in, and it wasn't necessarily in his proclaiming an obituary in terms of the institution of the Black church, but most definitely expressing some serious concerns. So I was really intrigued and pleased when you mentioned that you wanted to discuss and ruminate and share your perspective as an educator, as a divinity school student, and academician, and also you've participated in churches. You've had some official roles. So let's go for it. The waning of the Black church.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Tom. I give all honor and praise to God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And the article was from The Economist, and it was based on they were looking at a church in Chicago that they're referring to these churches as haunted houses.
Yes.
This is Olivet Baptist Church, and so this is a church that went up as far as 15,000 members and wound up eventually dropping down to about 250, and they're elderly. And interestingly enough, ABC, for those of you who watch, there's a show I guess called Soul of the Nation.
Yes, indeed.
And they did a program, I guess, a little while back on the Black church, and they had a pastor there, and he said basically the average age of his parishioners were over 60.
Yes.
And so what that article talks about is what Olivet did during the Great Migration. Black folks leaving the Jim Crow era. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about, really, I'm a migration baby. Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about the Great Migration, you can go from 1910 to 1970 to the early part of the 70s. And many of us that are what I call Vietnam babies, mm-hmm. we're that last leg of the Great Migration. So in terms of church, you had all these folks that church was, as you know, a central part of, especially for Black Southern life. They brought that up here. And they packed I'm just talking New Haven. Anybody that grew up in the 70s and 80s knows how these churches were packed out.
Yes.
Throughout the city, full, I remember they had to bring chairs from the downstairs just to accommodate all the seating.
Indeed.
During some of the services. And this was throughout the city. Everybody has that church, that they know about, whether, St. Matthew's, Trinity Temple, these churches, they were packed on a regular basis. So what that article talks about is how those churches were a major means of support for Black people when they arrived.
Yeah.
So what happens is you come up here from the South, and the church has clothes. So they have a clothing bank. So you come up here and there's clothes for you and your children. Church also has food bank. They provide food. And this is another key thing. The church provided information about jobs and what factories were hiring.
Yes.
So, and this is a major thing for people coming up from the South. I remember, distinctly, in talking to my mother and my aunts about coming up here. And when they came up here, that was one of the things is my grandmother, would make sure, well, what church are you going? Did you find a church home?
Right.
That's the first thing, because everyone understood the church as this centerpiece. So the article deals with how that has changed over time, and especially among millennials, where their church going rate is maybe around 30%. And my generation has dropped significantly as well, where we're running around maybe half to 60%,
right.
50 to 60%. So the other generation is the generation that grew up, my mother's generation, where church was always a centerpiece of their life. I tell people I might be I'm part of the late generation of kids who went to Sunday school on a regular basis.
Right.
Forget about, church. That's, Sunday school, you ask kids now, they're like, what's that?
So what feels, walk us forward in terms of, are you just reminiscing from a nostalgic standpoint, or are you suggesting that that natural occurrence, some things perhaps are not meant to live forever? I guess want the folks to kind of get a more clarity about your position regarding
Oh yeah. So there's a NPR just did an article on March 30th. And it's about fewer than half US adults belong to a church. That's just the United States in general.
Yes.
And we're behind. Europe is extremely secular. They don't fool with church at all, like we do. So what we have to look at are why those things happening. And one of the things in the Soul of a Nation program, he talks about Black Lives Matter and how, with the Black church's civil rights legacy, Black Lives Matter wasn't necessary, even though you still have groups that weren't as religiously oriented. So as SNCC, you had church people, but as older SNCC and younger SNCC were two different animals, so to speak. So you have that transition. But what has happened with us is, when you look at the Black church and the drop-in membership, if Black women historically have made up around 70% of the membership, and Black Lives Matter is led by Black women, founded by. And one of the things they talk about is breaking the patriarchal system that has historically repressed Black women. Then we need to address that patriarchy within the Black church. Because if the Black church is shrinking, that means Black women are leaving too. Black men, it's like, we're never there hardly in the first place, but it's really Black women.
So speak, and I'm glad you mentioned the ABC Network's series of shows, and also folks might have seen the Henry Skip Gates programs on PBS.
Yes, on the Black church.
Are you so to put you? Excuse me a second.
No problem. Shout out to my family. Those are two of my closest friends. It's like my brother and my sister.
Great. And family, so family is so important. So talk about family and church. So maybe as things change, we no longer have Model T cars.
Right.
We no longer have steamboats. Things we have electricity, but Ben Franklin, people think of Ben Franklin versus Tesla today. So there seems to be a transition. I'm trying to pin you down more on where you see our expression of our spirituality, and whether it has to be confined into a building.
Well, let's talk about types of churches and what happens. So, because that speaks exactly to that. So there are three types that I'm just going to talk about. And the first two are dying out. One is basically in terminal condition, the other one critical, and then there's the one that's basically swallowing them up. So the first type of church is a family-oriented church. Normally smaller, everyone knows everyone, but that church, you grow up in it.
Yes.
It's a family church. There's generations within that church. So you have churches where the parents might have come here from the Great Migration. The children, build a better life, and then their children do even better. So now you have this like professional class of folks in the church, family-oriented church. Those churches are dying out. That's the one that's terminal. Those are few and far between because they've been swallowed up.
So we'll call them small businesses then.
Right. They're like small businesses. And the next church is a congregation. A congregation is a larger church, but they still have that remnant of family, and a larger church still does ministry work. A family church is interwoven into the community, like into every aspect. That person from the teachers were there, the small business owners were there. Everybody, everyone knew, that even the activists in the community were connected to a family-oriented church. Congregational church is a bigger church, but what they are able to do is they're able to actually have ministries where they still impact the community, where, it might not be as much of a family, but they'll have like blocks of families within that church that do ministry because the church is bigger. So you have those, and those are, they're around, but, they've taken a beating over the pandemic.
Indeed.
Especially because you're talking about maintaining, financially sustaining, a large building and facilities and all those other things. And they've been swallowed up by the biggest church now. And people think, oh, it's a mega church. It's not so much the mega church physically as the ideology. And I call they're not churches, they're audiences. So
the current iteration, use the slang, the hot churches are ones that what?
It's an audience. You come to get entertained.
Okay.
You sit there. There's no demand on you in terms of the community. There's no demand on you in terms of a sense of family. There's none of it. You come, they put on a performance, and then you leave.
And your critique of that consumer behavior is what?
Well, if you think about it, especially for an evangelical church, an audience is perfect. Because if there's a detachment from the community, then you don't feel any obligation to confront the structures of discrimination and supremacy in your surrounding community. You come to church and it's more of it's like a motivational speech. It's all these things. And I say this all the time, and you've heard me say this before, where how we approach things like poverty is structural. The impact of poverty is spiritual, right. But if in a family-oriented church, those churches took an active role in confronting the conditions of the people. That's why Mount Olivet, the church we talked about earlier in Chicago, had things in place, right, because they understood the needs of the people. If your audience, you don't have to, you can do it. Doing a clothing drive or a food drive versus actually confronting policies that impact homelessness, confronting, family-oriented churches would confront things. They were the pillar of the civil rights movement, because they confronted things like discrimination. They confronted voter suppression. You out, Reverend Shuttlesworth, you couldn't be in leadership in his church. Reverend Shuttlesworth from the Civil Rights Movement, great leader, died in 2011. You couldn't be a leader in his church if you didn't have a voter ID card, or you hadn't gone down and at least attempted to register to vote.
But let me push back a little bit, if I might, because I'm interested in your perspective, because each one of our discussions, it reveals to me even more deeply how deep the legacy of James Cone and others is in your spirit. But I want to pose this question to you. Is it fair to say that you would, in a general sense, acknowledge that there's more social activism in terms of, just if you did a census, if you ask people, do you consider yourself to be a social activist? Let's say black men and women between 20 and 35. Would you say that that they would self-identify as being a social activist, more Black people between 20 and 35 than perhaps in previous years? So
I think to a degree. I think to an extent, because of the different organizations.
Indeed.
And because that role of the church has changed.
So what's wrong with that is my question. If there are people that are performing in the role of social gospel without even knowing what social gospel means, why is that? Why should they have to align themselves with something that they consider to be ancient and archaic?
Well, that's the issue. The issue is that with the church, and what it's facing is, it used to be that your social activism and how you defined yourself actually flowed through the church.
Yes, but now that it doesn't, so what's the significance? Maybe we've just moved on.
I think that the pastor in Soul of a Nation made an important point, that you're denying basically your legacy. Yes. when you step away from that. So basically, to say that the church isn't necessary or insignificant is basically saying that a major pillar of who we are as a people, you can't give that, you can't let that go. And it's unfortunate, because what you would want to see our churches teaching people about our history and our legacy is, I'll give you a prime example. Pre-pandemic, I had my aunt and my mother talk to my daughter and her first cousins about how they came up to New Haven.
Yes.
And why they came up here and what life was like before that. Because there's no context. If you don't look at the Black church and its legacy, you don't have a context, and you don't have a blueprint. And what you have a lot of times with young people, and I tell people, I fully understand what it's like to be a young person and to have older people be dismissive of you and not recognize your voice. One of the things you want to always tell young people, that being passionate and being intelligent doesn't necessarily equal wisdom. And wisdom comes from actual experiences from people that have gone through things. So to tap into that wisdom, and you can take it and use it however you want, but as a legacy, and it's very unfortunate, because you see this, I can tell you from a political standpoint, people feel so threatened by AOC because AOC is a younger version of like Bernie Sanders' legacy.
Right. Yeah.
So you're almost not worried about Bernie, because Bernie Sanders was 80. You're like, we want. But if they can, and that's always been my issue with the Democratic Party, is on the political side, Republicans, they groom their next group of leaders. Hawley and all those other ones.
Well, let me interrupt. You're losing people a little bit.
Okay.
I want to go back to again, we're discussing, and I want to rephrase on the table that young people that are activists that used to be activists in the church and in SNCC, they may have left the church, but they still might have maintained their social activism energy.
Right.
They left the energy, the institutional church. So I'm pushing back on you in terms of, can one still express their spirituality and community wisdom and not be affiliated with AME, Zion, Baptist, etc.?
Of course. Well, but that's the whole thing. I mean, you have organizations like, a prime example is Christian Community Action, with Reverend Grubbs, who doesn't, she's not tied, not boxed in to a
Right.
specific denomination, but she does deep and profound, ministry work.
Indeed.
And that's a big part of, in terms of the church expanding its vision, to understand that, to have a big tent. And this was what I mean by speaking to, issues around, the church and its issues around misogyny and issues around patriarchy. One of the major things in terms of the church, if we're going to look at ills that it needs to address, is what I call plantation theology, where you adopt, and James Cone, of course, addresses this all the time, but where you adopt this patriarchal notion where you have all these talented and gifted and committed Black women in the Black church. And instead of allowing them to just expand on that, you have some of these people, not all, of course, because there are some progressive preachers, but preachers who practice these regressive, these repressive measures on these women. And, it's patriarchal, where women can't take on these roles of leadership. So, and these conversations are happening, and then you're wondering why women are leaving the church. If it's hard to talk about misogyny when the number one misogynist is the preacher. It's hard to talk about patriarchy when the number one, the one practicing is the pastor.
Well, indeed, and you're using kind of a broad, if I can dare say, somewhat of a broad brush, because I'm sure there's some ministers who would.
No, I said that. Yeah, there's definitely some that are progressive and don't do that.
And so so I guess what I'm trying to suggest is the same way that we've moved from AME to AME Zion to CME to Baptist to Southern Baptist to Central Baptist to just our denominational, I won't say fractured, but our denominational differentiations. We may be at that historical stage where now we're moving to a transition moment about where does the social gospel lie in people's hearts and minds and how they express it. Because as you referenced, we are into the consumer education, consumer entertainment society. And you've seen some churches now that have the relaxed clothing kind of, there's no, you can wear casual clothing to church, and you know about the Saturday Night Live churches, the churches that have events on Saturday night, as well as churches that have events on Friday night, First Friday. So I think there's some accommodation attempts, but I'm trying to kind of, I'm pushing kind of hard on you versus some of our previous conversations about products often aren't, and I'm not being demeaning about calling the church a product, but products don't always survive unless sometimes they have to be rebranded, sometimes they morph. So they give you one other example. People will talk about the trains, the people in the train industry realizing that they weren't into train, they shouldn't have been in the trains, but in terms of transportation, so they wouldn't have let the airplane industry kind of overcome them. I'm suggesting that sometimes our structural archetypes do move and mutate and transform. We may be at an embryonic stage that we cannot perceive.
No, that's fine. Change is, sometimes change is not only necessary but good. But in terms of looking at the church's legacy, I'll give you a prime example as, an educator for 25 years. Every church, especially when we're talking just in general, but every Black church, I'll speak to the African-American church. Every African-American church, I can tell you as a teacher, should have a school calendar. I know some do. Every church should have a school calendar. They should know when parent night is. They should know when open house is. They should know when report card conferences are, and they should be conscious and cognizant of that, and make sure that they have events that support the families in that church. This is getting back to that that family
Right,
model,
right.
and that's also progressive.
But see,
Because what
let me interrupt, because again, you use the word should. And I think when we ever use the word should in our conversation, that's an aspiration and a vision and a desire. But the reality is that it's not happening in that way. So that's there are some churches that will uh, have a more structured event, as you're mentioning. But we got to watch when we use the word should, that immediately connotes a, a desire. But I'm trying to focus you on the reality that those opportunities, those social media opportunities have now gone. It could be like the Pandora's box. That Pandora's box has been opened, and whether you can put stuff back in might be for example, think of Luther for a second. Think of the radical Luther, the German theologian, how he had to kind of really bring the Catholic Church to a halt in terms of his radical proclamations. We may be at this stage where it's either live or die. And then when you think of the Protestant denomination started how? I mean, we had Catholicism, but how did we get the Church of England?
Right. Well, with that break over, the whole concept of annulling,
For example,
marriage. Right.
over a secular sexual desire. So I'm only suggesting, if we look at church history from the Western standpoint, there are some economics. When you think of Luther, and he was attacking the economics, you think of the Church of England breakaway due to sexuality, power, and desire. And then you think of Puritans in terms of them invading the United States. So history changes. You love history, I love history. But when you mention legacy, in my mind, I'm always curious about in my mind, we're always refashioning and reinterpreting what wisdom and history might be in terms of this current moment. We're in this current moment where the numbers are pretty clear that people are fleeing the structure, but I don't believe that people are fleeing their desire for healing and personal salvation and satisfaction.
And on that note, to piggyback on that, that was one of the issues I said in terms of especially with Black women leaving the church. There are very prominent Black womanist theologians, and it is a travesty if a church isn't at least making people aware of who these women are, whether it's Katie Cannon, who
Right.
Yeah, Renita Weems. I mean, one of the prominent ones is my professor right now, Manya Stubbs. And
Sure.
if you're not going to provide that info, because it provides a whole different perspective in terms of Black women and feminism and Black women's bodies and Black women's empowerment. If you don't, and that's a pillar of Black Lives Matter.
Yes. So I would suggest to you that, from my standpoint, from my analysis, particularly over the last 10 years, if we Googled the number of times that women's empowerment group would stand out, if we did a language search of women's empowerment seminars, women's empowerment this, women's empowerment that, in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been an explosion of women coming together. And I would dare say coming together, communing and coming together as a congregation, as a secular, quote unquote, congregation, but fulfilling their mission of female freedom, liberation, and equality. So I'm suggesting to you that the women's empowerment movement, in my mind, in the last 15 years, is the embodiment and tangible reference that people are still congregating together, coming together, but not under a denominational rubric.
Right. I get what you're saying. You're saying that these organizations, they exist and have exploded, just not within what we would call a traditional church.
Precisely.
Church body.
But Bishop Vaskey, I forget Bishop Vaskey.
Right. Varsha McKenzie.
There are a few that are trying to still maintain and keep it going.
And my issue is based on what our topic is why is that happening? I think, and why do they feel the need to just go, and what is going on within the church as an institution that would cause them? Because I think that's one of the major things we need to address is what is going on in terms of the Black church that is causing this flight, this massive flight over, maybe the past 20 years. I think it was up to, I think somewhere around 70% in general in the 1990s of people who still went to church. And now it's down to around, I believe, 47%.
Precisely. So when you use in any basic 101 marketing and consumer text, you hear about, first adopters cultivating your new audience, your new buyers. So as you indicated, the fact of having no more Sunday school, no more summer, Sunday school, not summer Sunday school. What do you
Vacation
call it?
Bible school.
Vacation Bible school. I can remember my vacation Bible school cookies and milk, and I can remember the superintendent of my church, Mount Airy Baptist Church in Pittsburgh, Mrs. Hawley, and I can remember we're about to embark on Easter. I can remember my Easter saying words. You memorize a certain script. So
yeah.
So
I
those
remember.
those things that you say it's gone. Whether we can bring it back, I'm not so certain, and nor am I so sure that it's that the cat might be out of the bag in this regard.
Right. I don't disagree with you, but see, that's the thing. I'm not saying that we need to bring those things back. What I'm saying is that we need to recognize that there has been a transition, but also there's a prime example is in Dr. Cone when he does the revision of Black theology and Black power. One of the first things he says is that his major mistake that he made was that he did not address issues of Black women and Black womanism in his work. He spoke in general terms about us as a people, but didn't address in his earlier work, which nobody was addressing back then. And that's why you had scholars like, Renita Weems and, like I said, Katie Cannon push this Stephanie Crowder pushed this stuff to the forefront. So he actually, and by him doing that, is so profound because what he did was he actually was introspective and said, this is what I did wrong. This is what needs to change. And this is how I'm going to remedy that, which he addresses in his later work. What I'm saying is the Black church needs to do that as well.
Yes, and so good luck to you and those that want to see that happen. I'm not laughing as a disparagement. I think it will certainly be an increasing challenge. And part of, guess as you were talking, my mind went to the president of Vanderbilt Seminary Divinity School, and the former, the lady that's formerly from Yale, who's now the president of Vanderbilt Divinity School, and Union has a female president as well. So, you can see in my mind the ladies capturing their rightful place in this whole theological discussion.
Yeah, and like I said, and with this drop off in membership, these old antiquated patriarchal systems are going to have to be addressed. And if they're not, I think it does speak to something you said earlier about a major paradigm shift where there'll be all these outside organizations and they'll move into prominence. And the only thing that will be left are these large, these audiences. I mean, God rest his soul, but James Cone, when I met with him a year before he passed, and I had all these questions, and he just stopped me and he said, Kevin, listen. He said, you need to study the evangelical church. He said, if you don't study them, then you don't understand what has happened to the Black church in the past 30 years.
Right. Well, for sure. And it's so great that we can use him as an academic linchpin, and just as Reverend James Cone, and just as you were talking, my mind, of course, went to, well, I shouldn't say of course, but went to T.D. Jakes. So, and T.D. will talk about that he has an educational component, a housing component, an economic component. So I'm just suggesting that in 2020, when you mentioned the Great Migration, there are a lot of economic, quote unquote, circumstances that led to people having to find some salvation, be it a literal salvation or a belly salvation. we're at this economic stage now where there's so many people that aren't as desperate, if you will, or as poverty stricken, that their sense of satisfaction, as you say, does go for more of the titillation and the entertainment and the audience kind of participation and the music, because sometimes church becomes more of a concert. Um, uh, so if Dr. Cone was around today, we'd love to have him comment on this discussion to kind of to see, for him to tell us how he sees the future. But he's not here, so we'll just have to kind of identify with his spirit and continue to dwell on his writings. Any kind of closing or other comments? Again, this is Holy Week kind of thing, so I don't want to disparage your commitment to that, to the importance.
No, not at all. I think with this upcoming Resurrection Sunday, I would say, I know they always push the Gospels and the crucifixion and the resurrection story in the Gospels, but I would say people, take a look at, we've been studying right now, take a look at 2 Corinthians, as the former president called it, 2 Corinthians. But take a look at that book, because what that book, 2 Corinthians, is the book that gets used a lot by televangelists. And I tell people what I learned in seminary, the most important thing was I stopped reading the Bible and I learned to study the Bible. And this is the big difference. When you read the Bible, you allow somebody to contextualize the Bible for you, which is very dangerous, because they basically provide you with a context for understanding it so they can manipulate it. But when you study the Bible, you develop your own context and you step outside and you start to look at all these other things. And when you do that, basically, for those of us as Christians, the Bible really speaks to you, and you come away with a really good understanding. So 2 Corinthians, when you read that, you'll see how it can be either a major point of liberation, or you see, as I like to say, you see the hustle. You see the hustle. You see it for what you see a lot for what it is, because it's really, Paul is dealing with issues around things like status.
Mm-hmm.
And the emphasis on status is this group called the super apostles that are coming in, and they're all about how important they are. And it really speaks to a paradigm shift that has pushed a lot of folks away in terms of the church, because it's really not about status. It's about service.
So you're on that note, and I want to try to be I won't say devil's advocate, that's not the right term to use during this conversation, but I've been somewhat debating with you prior. But let me shift. If I were if I was on your legal team, I think I hear you saying that, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, that the true interpretation that you just articulated, if that was shared more often and more frequently, it could reattract people. That people could be attracted once again to joining the freedom train.
It is, because what it comes down to, and Martin Luther King said this all the time, is valuing people. Mm-hmm. A modern day version of that is Reverend Benita Grubbs. In turn, my former pastor, Pastor Green, mm-hmm. Larry C. Green Sr. It's valuing people, because when you value people, there's a saying, and God rest his soul, a reverend, he used to be at Community Baptist, Cosby Marable, mm-hmm. said this to me. He said, and I was a young minister just starting out, he said, "Kevin, people don't care how much you know when they know that you care."
And so you'd place Reverend Barber in that same, in terms of the poor people's Moral Monday.
It's valuing people. Yeah, these are people the church used to, and I know some churches still do, but in a major way, especially when talking about the Black church, spoke to people who had been marginalized and on the fringes. Now, how can you do that when you have things like Cruising with the Bishop, before the pandemic? How everybody can't afford to go on a cruise, you know what I mean? Or special seats based on how much somebody paid. And the whole prosperity gospel, or you're looking at someone who, might have gone through, look at the pandemic and all the people that have been laid off. We have at least 55 million people in poverty in this country.
Yes.
Are you going to go to those people and tell them, oh, favor ain't fair? Like you did something wrong. You did something to deserve. That's like voter suppression and all the structures, domestic terrorism. People don't deserve these are people doing this. These are in voter suppression. These are laws. This isn't, I tell people they spiritualize this stuff. That's not God. If you think Mitch McConnell is acting on orders from God, or something's very wrong.
I want to give you the chance for the last word, but I'm not sure how to summarize my statement to you. But again, just as you were speaking in terms of the intersection between politics and market behavior and spirituality, my mind went to well, I guess there are two junior senators now from Georgia, but Raphael Warnock, mind went to him as a model of someone that kind of I would think in your mind embodies how you can understand the operation of Caesar and understand power even beyond Caesar's.
I would love, and I don't know if he's had a conversation yet, but I would love for him to discuss how he made the decision to go from being, a preacher at one of the most, he still is, pastoring one of the most prominent churches in America, to running for senator. I would love for him to give a detailed discussion of that process, because what he's done speaks very loudly in terms of, a lot of these, I don't want to characterize a whole bunch of preachers. I'll deal with the ideology. A lot of these people who practice what I call dollar store theology, Raphael Warnock flies in the face of that.
Indeed.
Because he actually went out and did something about it, and he's the swing vote. And so you can't say that we shouldn't be involved in the aspects of our community. And like I said, you can look at all of Paul's epistles, and building churches, he's addressing the community and how the different churches, whether it's, Galatia or Ephesus or Corinth or Rome, how they function within the community. So, you can't move away from that, and just as a quick final note, just so people understand it, dollar store theology, when I say that, I mean that, when you think of like buying fresh fruits and vegetables, you don't think of the dollar store. You don't think of things that are going to, sustain you. I think of the dollar store for things like napkins or candy. It's cheap, it's quick. It might serve a purpose. You might be able to use it. But see,
I want to, I do want to close, because I'm assuming you might have one or two books by Dr. James Cone readily available to you.
I do. I have the other stuff, but there's a couple of other ones. I have the stuff I always talk about, God of the Oppressed and Black theology. There's another really good book he did on Malcolm X and Martin and Dr. King.
So I want to close on you're giving us a final comment and lifting up the spirit of Dr. James Cone, the reading from one of the books that you're referencing, or just stating it as you recall it.
I have a ton of notes on him, right?
And I just want to mention that when you mentioned the dollar store phenomenon, I am not aware of any minister standing outside his or her, let's say, storefront or other edifices and demanding that people come in. So I'm always alarmed. I'm always bemused when people discuss their customer base. So although we might disparage a dollar store theology, there are people that buy it with their pennies. So it's really interesting in terms of social behavior and how the species relates to satisfaction. But let's conclude. Let's conclude with a comment from Dr. James Cone.
Okay, this is from, because because I wanted to deal, because we're talking about the Black church. And okay. So one of the things in Black theology and Black power that Dr. Cone talks about is that he says that in chapter 2 of Black theology and Black power, he says Jesus comes into the depth of the human experience to break our chains. And a lot of times we fail to bridge the gap between modern man and biblical man. And in other words, this whole thing of we spiritualizing Christ so much that we don't realize that, for us as for those of us who practice Christianity, when Christ was here, he specifically addressed the structures that were oppressing people.
Indeed.
And that's what we should be doing. And that's really speaks to issues that we brought up earlier, where you have a group like Black Lives Matter that is willing to get right out there and address those issues.
Indeed.
And the historically the Black church did that.
Indeed. And I hear you loud and clear in terms of, again, I just got a chill when you talked about breaking the chains, because we know about the popular song, but even more importantly, breaking the chains in terms of Dr. Cone, I'm sure, would be concerned about the bling world, the bling consumers of the chains moving into bling. And rather than breaking the chains, wasting our money on buying chains and wearing them around our neck versus giving homage to our internal spirit. So Kevin, thank you so much for this discussion. Really glad you were available.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Tom.
And in terms, as a side point, in terms of breaking the chains, can I mention that why you were delayed a little bit today?
Yes, definitely.
So you got your first or your second shot?
This is the second shot.
So you got your second shot, and in a very real way, I must say, as a testimony to my perception of myself, breaking the chains about mistrust, breaking the chains of not getting the vaccine. There's that metaphor. We had to break some of those chains that are artificially inspired upon us, versus and then move to a new ground of understanding.
Exactly. And one of the things that and I'll leave on this is that the Black church should be in constant dialogue with members of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Absolutely.
Because there should be a discussion that we should be building bridges.
Yes.
With them and understanding that the next generation has this is their take.
Yes.
On things. And so we need to connect with them and say, okay, and value it once again, value them, value their views, and say, okay, how can we make this something that, as a people,
absolutely,
we all stand together and move forward on.
And for those of you listening, really thank you so much for joining in. Kevin, I'm going to ask some people, one or two students up at the Div School, to maybe join us on the next discussion, because I've followed some of the recent graduates in particular, their ministerial journey, and I think you'll appreciate kind of having a dialogue with them together on Zoom.
That would be awesome.
Absolutely. So thank you again. Happy all holidays, everybody. Every 24/7, 365 is we need to celebrate things that are higher than ourselves and kind of acknowledge the existence. Kevin, thank you so much, man.
No problem, Tom. Take care.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.